Hi everyone. Let me tell you a story. A true story of the Tasmanian tiger. The Florentine Valley lies along the Gordon River in southern Tasmania. It spans an area of about 60 square kilometers, once entirely covered by forests of tall eucalyptus and other deciduous trees. To date, logging has significantly altered the landscape of the valley, which has naturally had an impact on wildlife populations. A century ago, these forests were home to many endemic species, including 3 of the world's largest carnivorous marsupials. The spotted quoll and Tasmanian devil were considered equal competitors, with the famous Tasmanian tiger occupying the top of the food chain. Every creature in the forest fled from it. There was not a single animal on the island that dared stand up to it. It would still reign as the apex predator of the Tasmanian wilderness if humans had not claimed the right to encroach on its population and habitat. Known variously as the Tasmanian wolf, zebra wolf and even marsupial or native hyena, but most correctly as the Thylacine, this mysterious and elusive marsupial was easily recognized by its unique appearance, the result of convergent evolution. This is the process by which unrelated animals develop similar traits as a response to similar environmental demands and to filling the same ecological niche. Hence, the coyote-sized Tasmanian tiger had the slender body of a weasel, the muscular legs of a grey wolf and the typical snout of a canid, while the sturdy kangaroo tail was inherited from a common ancestor. The striped pattern on its back enabled it to blend in with the branches of dense thickets, for which it was regarded as an excellent hunter, like the mighty tigers of the Asian jungle. Apex predators tend to inhabit vast territories, and Tasmanian tigers were no exception. They often lived solitary, but more commonly in family groups, each needing as much as 40 to 80 square kilometers of space to survive. Therefore, there was only one in the Florentine Valley. It was actually a couple, an adult male and a female, preparing to become parents for the first time. They were almost indistinguishable in appearance. The male should be slightly larger and up to 6 kilograms heavier than the female, but as he had just come of age and she was a year older, they looked almost the same size. Sexual characteristics were of no help either, as the Tasmanian tiger was the only marsupial species, except for the water possum of Central and South America, in which both sexes had a pouch on the belly. Although the males did not carry their young in it, it served as a protective sheath to cover their external genitalia. This was a very convenient adaptation, as they were probably the most agile and fast-moving of the predatory marsupials, but somehow they also had a rather long and cumbersome scrotal sac. If this had been constantly swinging and flapping as they ran, their testicles could have been injured. But because of the pouch, which kept them firmly in place, this did not happen. Tasmanian tigers reproduced throughout the year, but most offspring were expected in the spring and winter months. There are no visible signs of pregnancy in marsupials, only that the mother will lick her pouch thoroughly, a day or 2 before giving birth, to clean it for the arrival of the young. A female from the Florentine Valley gave birth in the spring of 1931, after a gestation period of about 1 month. Litter sizes were usually 2, 3, or 4 at most, but it was not uncommon for the first breeding season to produce only 1 pup. The heir to the Tasmanian tiger lineage in the valley thus promised a bit more pampered and plentiful youth. Weighing barely half a gram, and not much bigger than a grain of rice at birth, he was blind, deaf, and completely hairless. Despite his helplessness, he had enough strength to crawl into his mother's pouch. Fortunately, he did not exert himself too much, because, unlike kangaroos, Tasmanian tigers' pouches have an entrance at the back, close to the opening of the birth canal. He was coddled like a king in mother's pouch, sucking hard on all 4 teats and growing fast. Soon he began to see. And his hair, claws and teeth sprouted. Occasionally, the mother would expose him to the daylight by opening the pouch, to lick and clean him with her tongue. After 3 months, when the pup weighed just over 200 grams, he left the pouch for the very first time, with a little extra push from his mother's abdominal muscles. He was a smaller version of his parents, only slightly more intense in color. In Tasmanian tigers, the stripe pattern fades with age, and the cubs have the most conspicuous one. All 16 black stripes running down the pup's back, hind thighs, buttocks, and tail base, are a striking contrast to the yellowish-brown of the rest of the upper body and the lighter, cream-colored belly. Like zebras, tigers and many other animals, each Tasmanian tiger had a unique stripe pattern that allowed identification. Although not nearly as fluffy as the related pademelons and wombats, their coats thickened somewhat during the winter months when Tasmania was blanketed in snow, and were quite adequate to keep them warm on cold nights. Over the next few weeks, the pup often ran out of mother's pouch, to look around and play, but he always preferred to go back inside for longer distances. The mother always lay on her side, thereby relaxing her contractile muscles and making it much easier for the pup to enter. As he became bigger every day, the pouch barely fit him, with his thin, long, black tail hanging completely out of it. Although the juvenile had clearly outgrown his old home in the next week or two, he was not ready to leave his protector mother. He clung to her belly and the back of her thighs, the proximity of the pouch giving him a sense of security. When the mother had to go hunting, she would hide him in a hollow tree trunk, an underground hole, or better still, a rock cave, where he would be protected from birds of prey, such as the mighty Australian wedge-tailed eagle, and other potential enemies, like the Tasmanian devil. But fortunately, he never had to face such intrusive, unwanted visitors. With the exception of predation on young, carnivorous marsupials do not generally attack each other, but if a pup's life is in danger, his mother will do everything she can to protect it. Another 3 months have gone by. It was time for the little tiger to wean himself off milk and try meat. By November, he was half the size of his parents, and already strong enough to join them on the hunt, and start training his predatory skills. The trio always spent the light part of the day in the shelter of thickets or tall ferns, and only began to hunt when it was dark. They roamed the woods like ghosts, only speaking when something really bothered them. When they spotted a victim, they would split up, and set up an ambush. At the prey's momentary inattention, they would jump on it, or begin to chase it. During a group chase, in addition to low sniffing noises, they would usually bark quickly and softly, as if coughing, or make special, paired, yeet calls to communicate. A long, faintly heard whine, reminiscent of a wolf howl, was used to identify each other at greater distances. Adult Tasmanian tigers were not very good at smelling, relying more on sight, and especially hearing to track the prey. Their upright, rounded ears, nearly 10 centimeters long, would not miss a sound. Their large eyes, surrounded by a black patch to prevent glare from the sun, could see their prey from a considerable distance. If their view forward was blocked by an obstacle, such as tall grass or bushes, the parents used their thin, half-meter-long tails in a very special way. These tails were almost immobile, due to the partial fusion of the tail vertebrae that occurred when the tigers reached full adulthood. This was not a disadvantage, as such tails were very useful for support and balance, when standing on the hind legs, just as in kangaroos. Thus, prey could hardly disappear from the family's horizon. Unlike their relatives devils, Tasmanian tigers had surprisingly weak jaws, due to their longer snouts. Because of their lower bite force, they preferred smaller, hollow-boned prey, birds. Tasmanian native hens and Australasian swamp hens were often on their menu, as were dabbling ducks and Australian coots. Sometimes they even ventured to attack larger and more dangerous waterfowl, such as herons and black swans. Tasmanian emus were an ever more plentiful meal, but by this time, they were already extremely rare, practically extinct, so it was seldom that tigers came across one. If they could not find fowl, they made do with smaller mammals, especially other marsupials. Hunting brushtail possums, potoroos, bettongs, and bandicoots was no great challenge, and even the slightly larger pademelons and red-necked wallabies were generally considered easy prey. Rarely did they manage to kill a wombat, or even an eastern grey kangaroo, but they had to work hard and give it their all to hunt down this bouncy and brisk giant. And yet, running fast was not one of their virtues. In fact, with characteristic rigid and apparently clumsy gait, another result of a fused backbone and tail, they were probably unable to run faster than 40 kilometers an hour. But their endurance was incredible, thanks to their extremely muscular legs. Sometimes they would pursue a victim for hours, until it was completely exhausted. Even if the little, short-legged tiger didn't always make it to the end of the chase, he gained valuable experience by following and observing his parents. He was also exploring his home valley and becoming aware of the boundaries of his parents' territory, which father regularly marked with his scent. The young male's instincts told him that he would soon have to cross this border. It was the middle of January. For a while, the mother had almost forgotten her son and the father had become completely distant. At 9 months old, the young tiger had almost grown up, switched to a meat diet, learned the laws of nature and how to survive in the Tasmanian wilderness. It was time for him to become independent. One night, when his parents strongly objected to his joining the hunt, he finally left them. He wandered to the far south of the Florentine Valley, which was not part of his parents' territory. By the morning, he was already making his way through the trees that did not stink of his father. After a few days of exploring the new territory, he was convinced that it was still unoccupied and that he could claim it for himself. Using anal glands and the glands on his feet, he began to spread his scent, just as father had done. His new home range consisted of a large temperate rainforest, with some wetlands and heaths in between, making it the perfect hunting ground for a Tasmanian tiger. However, the young male was not at his best for the next few months, as he settled into the role of solitary hunter. On most hunts, he had to make do with small prey, such as frogs, lizards, and native rodents, like the Rakali water rat. He would often attack unprotected nests and take a few eggs. More difficult attacks, such as on native hen or the agile wallaby, usually failed. One day, short after sunset, he went to a stream to catch some fish. He was surprised and appalled to see a thick, wriggling stick jutting out of the water in the middle of the stream and slowly approaching the bank. It was a short-beaked echidna, a hedgehog-like mammal and one of only 5 living species of monotremes. Echidnas are very sensitive to heat, so after a hot day they like to cool off by swimming. They do this by submerging their entire body, leaving only their snout above the water, using it as a snorkel. Tasmanian tigers do not often attack these muscular animals with strong claws and stocky bodies, covered in a mass of 5 centimeters long sharp spines. But the young predator decided to have a try. In the water, the echidna was unable to curl up into a ball to protect its vulnerable spineless underside, a defense mechanism it uses on land. The tiger leapt into the water and began to gnaw mercilessly at the soft skin of its belly. The victim was a male weighing almost 4 kilograms, so it was not easy to drag him ashore. The tiger ignored the fact that his face had several small puncture wounds. This was his biggest catch yet, so he was jubilant. But his elation soon wore off, as he realized that it was impossible to get at the tasty meat without getting stabbed in the snout, neck, or paw by one of the hard spines. Days passed, but the tiger no longer had the opportunity to find careless and unprepared larger animals. The bite-sized prey, which did not even come close to satiating him, remained his constant. Despite his weakness from hunger, he survived until July, when he experienced the misery of a Tasmanian winter for the first time. The year before, he had spent those months in his mother's warm pouch, never dreaming of cold and snow. For a young tiger, finding food in these unfamiliar conditions became even more difficult. With temperatures as low as 8 degrees Celsius, animals didn't like to roam, preferring to snuggle up in their cozy dens. So the starving loner patrolled his home range in vain, unable to find anything to eat. One night, however, fortune smiled upon him. He came across a dead fallow deer fawn, probably succumbing to disease, or the hardships of winter. Fallow deer were not native to Tasmania, but were introduced by Europeans in the 1830s, and to mainland Australia half a century later. They adapted well to their new environment, and their population grew rapidly. The young tiger had always avoided carrion, but this time he could not resist. He returned to the carcass several nights in a row, and fortunately, did not have to endure the company of other scavengers during his meals. The snow cover did not last long. Warmer months followed, and his hunting success improved considerably. His tail finally became stiff and rigid in movement. He could now stand on his hind legs, as his mother and father had once done, to rise above the tall vegetation and ambush potential prey. He also maintained a habit of returning to the stream, where one day he managed to kill another species of monotreme, the Tasmanian platypus, which grows much larger than the platypus from mainland Australia. But suddenly, the young tiger was no longer interested only in food. In the spring of 1933, he turned 2 years old, and became sexually mature. He regularly patrolled the boundaries of his territory, sniffing for signs of eligible females. One night, while scouting for mating opportunities, the wind carried a strange smell of flesh into his nostrils. He was famished, so he could not resist. He had never encountered such a smell before, but it reminded him a lot of fallow deer. Actually, he was smelling mutton, fresh lamb offal. The intensity of the scent increased, until the tiger found himself in a clearing. In the middle of it, next to a freshly cut tree stump, was a splinter sticking out of the ground, with a heady-smelling piece of meat hanging from its tip. The tiger bit into it, and the sharp tip stuck in his throat. He lifted his head in pain and pulled the splinter out of the ground, whereupon he felt a strong squeeze, for the splinter was the trigger of a snare that caught his right hind leg. He quickly dragged the unpleasant wooden object out of his mouth, but could not free himself from the snare. Soon he stopped struggling and pulling, as it only tightened and made a deep wound. Desperate, frightened, and helpless, he sat down. The poor unfortunate wretch was the victim of Elias Churchill, the local woodcutter, keen trapper, and fur hunter. He regularly hunted Tasmanian tigers near the Gordon River at the government's instigation. As the young tiger's territory did not overlap with farmland, he had never encountered humans. He had no idea that his species was in such deep trouble, having been cruelly abused by humans for many years. This human harassment began long ago, but not in Tasmania. What happened on this island off South Australia was just the latest stage in the loss of the Tasmanian tiger. The only modern member of the genus Thylacinus, and indeed of the entire family Thylacinidae, it evolved in the early Pleistocene and by 400 years ago was widespread across Oceania, inhabiting most of mainland Australia as well as New Guinea to the north and Tasmania to the south. Then, about 500 years later, South Asian colonial settlers brought medium-sized, sandy-colored dogs, ancestors of today's wolf subspecies called the dingo, to New Guinea and Australia. The settlers valued these dogs for their speed, agility, and stamina, so they domesticated them to help them chase prey. The local Aborigines were equally impressed and happily adopted them as hunting companions. But many of the dogs escaped into the wild, where they began to breed. Because dingoes are placental mammals, considered more evolved, intelligent, and generally more successful than marsupials, they were much better predators than Tasmanian tigers. They easily outcompeted Tasmanian tigers for habitat and prey, and likely preyed on their young and adults themselves. As a result, tigers were continually pushed out and by 3,200 years ago had been completely driven off the Australian mainland, probably including the island of New Guinea. Fortunately, dingoes did not manage to spread to Tasmania. There, a population of only 4,000 or 3,000 tigers managed to survive, but at least they were isolated from superior carnivorous competitors and humans. Almost 3 millennia had passed before the Tasmanian tigers faced another deadly wave of problems. It started around 1800, when British settlers began arriving on the island in large numbers. In 1824, sheep were introduced en masse to Tasmania's vast and grazable grasslands, with the aim of expanding the wool industry that was already flourishing in neighbouring Australia. The negative consequences of settlers' reckless decisions and greed soon became apparent. The fencing of the pastures robbed the wildlife of its home. And the livestock, of course, did not cope well at first and were subjected to great stress in their new environment in the middle of the Tasmanian wilderness. Both were clearly worse off. Although Tasmanian tigers, then the most abundant in the northern part of the island, avoided people and their sheep as befitted their shy and secretive nature, their beastly, wolf-like appearance gave them a bad reputation. Farmers began to blame them for the frequent mass deaths and massacres of their herds, when in fact these were mostly due to the mistreatment of domestic animals and sheepdogs that had escaped into the wild and become feral. Farmers even resorted to media manipulation to convince the government of the damage allegedly caused by Tasmanian tigers. The most pompous and notorious example was a photograph that appeared in many Australian newspapers and magazines in 1921. It also led to the Tasmanian tiger being hailed as a chicken thief. But it was a huge scam. The photo that was published was actually cropped to hide the background. When the real photo came to light, it was clear that it was a staged captivity scene. Furthermore, a later analysis of the photo even revealed that the specimen shown was not even alive but stuffed. The truth is that even if the Tasmanian tiger did occasionally take the opportunity of easy prey and kill a chicken or lamb, the theory that this would destroy the income of the entire poultry and sheep husbandry was exaggerated and silly. In addition, in 2011, scientists at the University of New South Wales used advanced computer modelling to prove that Tasmanian tigers' jaws were too weak to break the bones of a larger mammal, and their canine teeth could not make deep enough wounds to reach the internal organs to kill an adult sheep. They were probably only able to handle prey weighing no more than 5 kilos, or 45% of their own body weight to be precise. In any case, they never attacked or injured humans. But in those days, people bought into the farmers' and breeders' opinions. Tigers began to be hunted and killed en masse. As early as 1830, cash bounties were offered for kills by a powerful private farming corporation, essentially a group of London merchants planning a wool-growing venture to supply the needs of the British textile industry. And in 1888, even the Tasmanian government decided to pay bounties, and very generous ones at that. An adult head earned the hunter £1, the equivalent of about £130 today. A killed pup was worth half that, 10 shillings, or about £70 in today's money. By the time of its irreversible abolition in 1909, the government had paid a total of 2,200 bounties, of which about 150 were for pups. However, it is thought that many more animals were killed unofficially, bringing the total to at least 3,500, more than 3/4 of the total population. Most of the tigers Elias caught in his snares were badly injured from struggling against the noose, so he killed them on the spot. However, because the young tiger remained calm, he was hardly injured by the trap. He spent the rest of the night agitated and unsure of what was going to happen to him. At dawn the next day, Elias set out to see his traps. His eyes sparkled as he saw the tracks of a four-legged animal in the muddy forest path, leading in the direction of his trap. The experienced hunter knew every creature that could be found in these forests, so he knew exactly what to expect. The Tasmanian tiger's footprint was distinctly different from those of other animals of similar size. Foxes, feral cats, and dogs all have rather large digital pads compared to the main pad, whereas the Tasmanian tiger, like the quoll and the devil, had very small digital pads arranged in an almost straight line and a large main pad segmented into 3 distinct lobes. Its hind feet were similar to its forefeet, except that the former had only 4 digits instead of 5. In addition to each fingerprint, there were obvious claw marks, as the Tasmanian tiger could not hide its claws like a cat, but they were always outstretched. Elias followed the footprints deep into the forest for a while. As he approached the bush, and then the clearing where he had set the trap the day before, he smelled the distinctive foul odor that Tasmanian tigers often give off when disturbed. But this defense mechanism did not deter the hunter. As he trotted noisily through the bushes, the young tiger was startled. This was his first encounter with a human enemy. Elias had been prepared all along to use his rifle, but the sight of the animal made him think it was not worth killing. He said to himself,
"Damn, mate, you're a beautiful beast, aren't you? No barking, you're bloody scared of me, huh?"
He was a very fine young specimen and incredibly calm, so the hunter decided to send him to a private zoo he had been associated with in the past. Although the tiger showed no signs of aggression, the man was unwilling to risk a bite and wanted to approach him safely. Such sharp teeth are no joke, so he pulled a couple of extra nooses from his pocket. He approached the tiger carefully, wrapped the noose around the snout and knotted it tightly so that the animal could not open its jaws. With another noose, he tied the tiger's legs together. Then, he slung the animal around his neck and headed south. By his estimation, the beast weighed just over 18 kilos, which was a lot for a barely mature male. And so, the young tiger left his home in the Florentine Valley for good. After walking almost 5 kilometers, they reached Elias' wooden hut. During the journey, the tiger was so tame that the hunter stopped several times to check that he was still alive. At the hut he chained him to a dog chain, which annoyed him greatly. He raged up and down, trying to break it off. So, Elias hastily built him a pigsty-like pen out of some felled logs so he could move around freely. Tasmanian tigers cannot jump high into the air, so the young tiger had no chance of escaping, but he marched tirelessly up and down the wooden walls of the enclosure for hours, looking for a gap large enough between the logs. When he realized there was no point in continuing, he lay down, but he was far from relaxed, just hiding his restlessness and tension. He kept giving Elias a sullen glare. The hunter sneered at him, thinking of how he was going to make a fat profit. The zoo was prepared to pay a hefty £20 for a healthy adult, but the sale was not officially publicized because at the time the government was discussing a total ban on ground-based snares, so hunters could be fined for using them. Elias was not surprised that his captive had no appetite at first. But when he ignored the dead wallaby for a few days and refused to kill a live one when offered, the hunter began to worry. He could not allow such beauty to rot before his eyes. He then slaughtered the wallaby he had brought into the enclosure and spent so much time forcing the bloody piece of meat under the tiger's snout that it whetted his appetite. Eventually he devoured the fresh carcass, bone, and all. It was no problem for him to swallow several kilos of food in a short time because his stomach was very muscular and could stretch a lot. This adaptation allowed the Tasmanian tiger to consume all its prey after a large kill, thus providing for any periods of starvation or unsuccessful hunting. A few days later, Elias tied the tiger up again, threw him on the back of a packhorse and rode to the nearest railway station in Tyana, where he handed him over to an animal dealer who supplied wild-caught animals for display at country shows and carnivals, and sometimes for zoos. This man locked him in a cage in a goods wagon. After a train journey of 80 kilometers, the terrified tiger arrived in Hobart, the capital of Tasmania. In May 1933, he was admitted to the local Beaumaris Zoo, where he was deemed to be in very good health. The wound on his right hind leg had healed, but the ring-shaped scar remained, reminding him of Elias the hunter who had stolen his freedom. He had come to see humans as his greatest enemy, and the keepers in his new home were quick to recognize this from his disdainful behavior. Hobart Zoo, also known as Beaumaris Zoo, has always been famous for its Tasmanian tigers. A few years before the young tiger, a family of 4 lived here when a hunter named Walter Mullins caught a female in Florentine Valley carrying 3 developing pups in a pouch. Sadly, the mother and 1 pup died of disease shortly after arriving at the zoo, and another died after just 2 years. Staff hoped that Churchill's tiger and now Beaumaris Zoo's new resident, who they have named Benjamin, would have fewer health problems. At just over half a meter tall, 112 centimeters long and with a 53 centimeter tail, Benjamin was one of the largest carnivores there. He was kept in a fairly large mesh enclosure, but still felt very cramped. Although he always had enough to eat, being served mostly chicken or rabbit, sometimes beef or horse, all he wanted was a wallaby, which he would have caught with his own sharp claws. He suffered, as did the rest of his species in the wild. Intensive hunting to destroy the population and obtain their valuable striped skins, combined with several other factors, notably intensive human settlement and consequent habitat destruction, an outbreak of a distemper-like disease that left them with severe hair loss and scabs all over their bodies, competition for food with introduced feral dogs, and the extirpation of animals that Tasmanian tigers preyed on, have all contributed to their decline. Once common predators, they have become extremely rare, but most people don't think much about it. Although some conservationists began to warn and campaign for the protection of these marsupials as early as 1901, their views did not change the public's perception of Tasmanian tigers as pests. The first wise move was made as late as 1928, when the Tasmanian Advisory Committee for Native Fauna issued a proposal to establish a nature reserve in the Arthur Pieman area on the west coast of Tasmania, where the largest remaining population of tigers was thought to be found. Unfortunately, the situation did not improve. In May 1930, the last known case of a Tasmanian tiger being shot in the wild was recorded. It was killed by Wilfred Batty, a farmer from Morbana in the far northwest of the island. As he later said, he had good reason for the cull, as the male had been prowling around his hen house for several weeks, threatening the hens. It was quite large and a nice specimen, so he put it up against the fence and posed beside it with his rifle and dog. Wilfred's friend Pat O'Halloran took the photograph that has become an icon of the ruthless and irrational terror that man is capable of in his greed to dominate every living thing. And yet, despite increasingly rare sightings in the wild, most people did not even believe that the infamous striped beast was actually disappearing from Tasmania. One of the first to realize that the world's largest carnivorous marsupial was on the brink of extinction was the renowned and respected Australian naturalist David Howells Fleay. He had always been interested in endangered animals, especially native species, including platypus, emu, and of course, all marsupials. He visited Hobart Zoo shortly after the arrival of the new Tasmanian tiger. He was absolutely thrilled to see Benjamin. Knowing he would not have many more opportunities to admire this remarkable creature, he asked to be permitted to photograph the handsome young male up close. Joined by keeper Arthur Reed, he entered the enclosure where the tiger posed for him in a sitting and lying position, scratching his fur, pacing up and down the edge of the enclosure, kangaroo-style bipedal hopping and the legendary yawn, opening his snout to an incredible 80 degrees. The Tasmanian tiger could open its jaws wider than any mammal that has ever lived, but it is still not known whether this ability was actually useful for anything. One common theory is that the gaping mouth was a warning or sign to retreat if someone came too close to the tiger. David probably did not understand this. He kept filming until he caught it. The jaws of the largest carnivorous marsupial may not have a reputation for being the strongest, but the 46 sharp teeth still delivered a concrete bite. David, of course, held no grudge against Benjamin. In fact, he was proud of the wound on his buttocks and carried the scar proudly throughout his life. A more appropriate souvenir could hardly have been given to him by one of the most remarkable marsupials he has dealt with in his career. The recordings made also meant a great deal to David. He compiled them into a 45-second black and white film that became world famous many years later, after the Tasmanian tiger was officially declared extinct. The next 2 years were torturous for Benjamin. The usually very noisy visitors, who liked to provoke him by banging on his fence to elicit his menacing growls and hisses, were very hard to bear. Despite this, he was one of the zoo's biggest attractions, with crowds of people constantly thronging around his enclosure. Everyone was fascinated by his intimidating jaws, which he could open to an astonishing extent. The poor wretch lived in squalid conditions. The zoo staff didn't take the best care of him, but this was the Great Depression time, so the people of Hobart couldn't afford to maintain a zoo full of exotic animals. Benjamin was given less meat each night, his enclosure became neglected, and they often forgot to unlock his sleeping den, leaving him outside in the cold for whole nights. He nearly froze to death, especially during the harsh Tasmanian winter. While the zoo ignored Benjamin's failing health, the authorities stopped turning a blind eye to the fact that they had completely wiped out Tasmanian tigers in the wild. Even in zoos in other parts of the world, most of the specimens had already died, so the task of obtaining photographic and video material of the very last tiger has fallen entirely to Beaumaris Zoo. In 1935, Sidney Cook, a cameraman for the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia, made a 21-second film of Benjamin walking around the enclosure. The following text was added to the clip.
The Tasmanian tiger, easily distinguished by his straight, unjointed tail, is also a dangerous opponent, though, like the devil, is now very rare, being forced out of its natural habitat by the march of civilization. This is the only one in captivity in the world.
For some reason, Cook's footage was lost in the Australian Film Archives, only to resurface in 2020. In May 1936, a young photographer called Ben Shepherd visited Beaumaris Zoo with the sole purpose of photographing the last surviving Tasmanian tiger. He took just one photo, but it quickly became famous. Today it is one of the most widely shown and reproduced images of a Tasmanian tiger ever captured. Later, it turned out that Ben Shepherd was also the last person Benjamin posed for. On the 10th of July 1936, Thylacinus cynocephalus was finally given official protection by the Tasmanian government. But of course, the awakening came very late. Just 59 days later, on the night of 6 to 7 September, at the height of Tasmania's coldest winter in a century, the last surviving Tasmanian tiger died of hypothermia because his sleeping den had been locked again. His carcass was sent to the local Hobart Museum, where it was decided to keep only the skeleton and skin. The fate of the organs remains a mystery, but it is highly likely that they ended up at the Institute of Anatomy in Canberra. The sad news of Benjamin's death initially received little media coverage and was only reported in one morning newspaper. No one really believed that he was the last of his kind. They hoped that after a few years of no hunting, these amazing beasts would increase in numbers, and everything would be back to normal. It must have taken decades without a credible sighting for Tasmanians to realize that the magnificent creature they had also chosen as the symbol of their state coat of arms and the official logos of the Tasmanian government, had in fact been eliminated from the face of the earth. It seemed a shame that no more attention had been paid to Benjamin. Many years later, the authorities decided to give more importance to the day of his death. Since 1996, Australia has celebrated National Threatened Species Day on the 7th of September, to highlight the importance of native animals and plants that are unfortunately struggling to survive. In 2021, the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia marked the day in a very special way. On the 85th anniversary of Benjamin's passing, they released a 1 minute and 14-second colorized version of Fleay's famous 1933 film, the longest footage ever recorded of a live Tasmanian tiger. Credit for the colorization goes to French film producer Samuel François Steininger. The demanding process of transforming what was a very short film took more than 200 hours, but Benjamin undoubtedly deserved such an honor. Today, new facts about Benjamin's tragic story emerge almost on a daily basis. His skull, the rest of his bones and of course the beautiful prepared skin, which are exhibited in a specially built display case to preserve the specimens and prevent them from fading, have recently attracted the attention of biologists because of a shocking discovery. Museum curators found a lost taxidermist's report in an old archive and realized that the remains actually belonged to an old female. It turned out that Benjamin had not survived the full 3 years in captivity. Tasmanian tigers were generally very sensitive to stress, so their lifespan was relatively short. Those born in the wild lived only 5 to 7 years, and those born in captivity 8 to 11, but captive ones never lived that long. Benjamin probably died in May 1936, but was quickly replaced by a female, which the zoo did not tell visitors about so they would not notice. This old sick animal, which may possibly have been Benjamin's mother, and which had also been caught illegally in a snare trap by none other than Elias Churchill, lasted only 2 months. Many people were outraged that we did not know about this swap for so long, although it is not really a big deal, because neither Benjamin nor this female were really the last of their kind. Although there have been no reports of live specimens or recordings of them since the tragic 7th of September 1936, scientists agree that the large number of anecdotal sightings makes it almost certain that the species continued to exist for at least another decade, and some even believe that Tasmanian tigers, avoiding all contact with humans, survived well into the late 1990s, perhaps even into the 2000s. This is certainly possible. After all, almost half of Tasmania is still forested, and 40% is unexplored, so there is hope that the Tasmanian tiger is hiding somewhere. In addition, people from Tasmania and even parts of Australia still occasionally report encounters with Tasmanian tigers, with recent analysis suggesting that there have been more than 1,200 such cases since 1936, some even supported by photographic evidence. Of course, given the dog-like appearance and poor quality of the photographs, it is possible that many of these cases were misidentifications. The chance sightings of tourists, hikers and campers are rightly difficult to trust, but there are more reliable sources, as many cryptozoological subcultures and enthusiastic amateur naturalists have been keen to find possible surviving specimens in the years since Benjamin's death. Certainly, the Tasmanian tiger has aroused more obsession, suspicion, and controversy than any other creature ever declared extinct. Even universities have spent a fortune on traps, cameras, and major expeditions to find it. But all their attempts have sadly failed to capture, or at least photograph clearly, this enchanting, almost mythically beautiful marsupial. Perhaps the closest anyone ever came was David Fleay, who in 1945 set out with his family on a 4-month expedition into the wilderness around Jane River in western Tasmania, with the aim of capturing a live male and female to breed in his Victorian sanctuary, and save the species. He set up snares with extra padding to prevent them hurting the animals. But this made the traps ineffective, as one of the animals got caught and escaped without a scratch. It did, however, leave behind a tuft of hair, which Fleay kept. As he said, he positively identified it as that of a Tasmanian tiger. But even the famous marsupiologist did not remain optimistic after this unsuccessful hunt and gave up hope that the species could possibly be saved from extinction. In the second half of the 20th century, alleged sightings of specimens, vocalizations, footprints, and other signs suggesting that the species may not be completely extinct were most frequently reported from the areas explored by Fleay, so western and especially northwestern Tasmania. However, scientists have long pointed out that we may have been too quick to write off the possibility of Tasmanian tigers surviving in the wilds of Western New Guinea and Papua New Guinea. The argument is that the island where these two countries are located is undoubtedly one of the most remote, unspoilt, wild, and primitive places in the world, about whose nature we know remarkably little. Although it is believed that there are thousands of species still unknown to science, New Guinea is already home to an immense biodiversity, containing almost 10% of the total species on the planet, roughly the same as the United States, which is 20 times larger in area. This Melanesian tropical paradise is mostly covered in rainforest, but there is also a lot of mountainous terrain. It is therefore very challenging to traverse, and once you venture into it, it is difficult to make contact with the outside world. There may be no major cities in this wilderness, but there are nearly 1,000 indigenous tribal groups speaking almost as many different languages. It is estimated that there are at least 40 tribes that have never had any contact with modern civilization. We know from experience that these people are very suspicious of newcomers and can react violently when they encounter explorers. This, combined with the aforementioned characteristics of the terrain and the inability to communicate with the outside world, makes scientific expeditions to this part of the world very dangerous and virtually impossible. As a result, large parts of New Guinea remain completely unexplored. It is not inconceivable that the Tasmanian tiger has been successfully hiding there for several millennia, while we thought it was extinct, unable to compete with the ancestor of the dingo. But we should know that in New Guinea, a different lineage to the modern Australian dingo evolved from introduced dogs. They are called New Guinea singing dogs, or New Guinea Highland dogs. Not much is known about them, other than that they live in a harsh and remote environment between 3,900 and 4,200 meters above sea level, and that they vocalize in a truly unique way. Although, interestingly, they do have something in common with the Tasmanian tiger. They were declared extinct because no credible scientific evidence of their presence was reported for almost half a century. But in 2016, a team of biologists with hidden cameras finally succeeded to find and photograph a small surviving population. Then, in 2018, they managed to observe 18 dogs in the wild, studying their behavior, demographics, and morphology. The overall population is probably very small, and because they live so high in the highlands and are slightly smaller, less aggressive and timider than the Australian dingo, they may not have completely dominated the Tasmanian tigers in the past. If scientists have spent decades trying to rediscover the Highland singing dogs, which live in large packs and are so named because of their really loud calls, it seems quite understandable that they have simply not been able to find the silent marsupial, which lives alone or at most in pairs. Another animal example that gives us cause for optimism is a large terrestrial bird called the black-naped pheasant pigeon, which was thought to be extinct for 140 years until it was captured on a trail camera on one of the islands near the eastern tip of New Guinea, just a few years after the singing dogs. New Guinea may well be the next best hope for finding the Tasmanian tiger. Many of the villagers or local guides who can actually communicate with members of the indigenous tribes in their own language occasionally hear a story from them about the creature they called dobsegna, or striped dog. Only a few years ago, the scientific world was stunned by a rumor that a man from a remote coastal village in Papua New Guinea had found 2 striped dog puppies in a hollow tree trunk in the rainforest and taken them home. He wanted to domesticate them to help him hunt. Although one of the puppies was frightened to death and died soon after, he managed to raise the other for a year and brought it to semi-adulthood. As the man described his pet as having the characteristics of a Tasmanian tiger, scientists decided to investigate. But by the time they reached the village, another dog from the village had fought the alleged tiger and killed it. The owner then cooked and ate it. The disappointed researchers were left with a pile of charred and destroyed bones. Only the lower jawbone was in slightly better condition. Several experts have already looked at photographs of it and agree that it could be that of a Tasmanian tiger. If the villagers' account is true, it may seem like a huge missed opportunity from a scientific point of view, but let's just say, it's more of an incentive to keep digging. But just as there are people who want to find the tiger, there are others who hope it will never return. There are rumors that at the end of the 20th century, some interests, probably logging companies, tried to bribe hunters, park rangers and even scientists to find any Tasmanian tigers that might still be alive, with the intention of killing them and destroying their carcasses so that conservation organizations would not have the slightest chance of ever finding them. We need to know that if the Tasmanian tiger were to be rediscovered, the Tasmanian government would have to launch a program to protect the species and its habitat, declaring large areas as protected national parks, which would mean an unquestionable end to all logging. In fact, Something similar happened in the Benjamin's native Florentine Valley, but not because a surviving Tasmanian tiger was found. In 2009, Tasmanian police there carried out a series of arrests of protesters who were holding rallies to protect nature and stop large-scale logging. Despite a heavy-handed police crackdown and frequent sentencing, activism continued and escalated in the following years. The conservationists' efforts finally paid off in 2013, when the area was declared a national park and inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List. Since then, logging in the valley has been strictly prohibited. It is clear that we must continue to work to limit the negative impact on nature in the future, otherwise many species, including the already endangered spotted quoll and Tasmanian devil, could suffer a similar fate to that of the famous Tasmanian tiger. Of course, it is understandable that loggers want to keep their jobs. After all, the timber industry is the only employment option and the only source of income for those Tasmanians who are less educated or do not live in cities like Hobart. But we need to recognize that this is not just a conflict between humans and 3 species of carnivorous marsupials. Australia has the highest mammal extinction rate of any country in the world, having lost 39 species or 10% of its terrestrial mammal fauna since the beginning of European settlement. If we do not stop this negative trend now, the relationships between producers, prey and predators will continue to break down, meaning the whole ecosystem is heading for collapse. We will lose not only animals, but also plants and especially trees, because they will not be able to regenerate as quickly. Ironically, the endemic marsupial species must survive if Tasmania's timber industry is to be sustained. A healthy, stable ecosystem is therefore a prerequisite, but this will not be possible until the Tasmanian tiger returns to its apex predator role. Thankfully, we can be almost certain that this will happen, whether or not they manage to sensationally rediscover it in some remote Tasmanian or New Guinean place cut off from the rest of the world. With more than 700 stuffed or otherwise preserved Tasmanian tigers, including 11 alcohol-preserved pouch young specimens, not only in Tasmania and Australia but in museums and universities in as many as 23 countries around the world, the scientists have been working since 1999 to bring the species back to life through genetic engineering. So-called de-extinction, also known as resurrection biology or species revivalism, is the process of generating an organism that either resembles or is an exact extinct species. But the fact that reproducing animals from their genetic material is by no means cheap, and we don't have much experience with it, has long seemed an insurmountable problem. Fortunately, a newly formed American biotechnology company has just managed to overcome the obstacles of funding and refining genetic engineering methods with high tech. In August 2022, it was announced that this company, in partnership with some Australian scientists, would attempt to recreate the Tasmanian tiger within a projected timeframe of just over 10 years. They have managed to extract DNA from 108-year-old remains preserved in the Victoria Museum. From this they have constructed, or more correctly sequenced, the entire genome of the species. To fill in some of the gaps in the structure of the extracted DNA caused by age-related degradation, they relied on the genomes of other Dasyurides as models. Members of the diverse family Dasyuridae, commonly known as marsupial carnivores, are the closest living relatives of the Tasmanian tiger. There are 71 recognized species in this family, excluding a few that have probably gone extinct recently. The spotted quoll, also commonly called the tiger quoll, was long assumed to be the tiger's closest evolutionary cousin of all the Dasyurids, but we now know that it is actually the little-known fat-tailed dunnart, a cuddly marsupial that looks like a pale-colored mouse. Although it is still 70 million years evolutionarily divergent from the Tasmanian tiger and has a body mass almost 1,000 times smaller than it, this critter will play a key role in the process of de-extinction of its relative. Scientists will use gene editing technology to closely match the dunnart's DNA to that of the tiger. They will then insert the modified Tasmanian tiger cell nucleus into a fat-tailed dunnart egg. This will create an embryo that, due to the correction of gaps using genomes from other species, will not be 100% original Tasmanian tiger, but will be extremely close. The embryo will then be implanted into a surrogate mother. After a gestation period of about 40 days, the female fat-tailed dunnart will give birth to the genetically engineered offspring, but as she will be unable to care for them due to the size difference, they will be raised by biologists. Once these joeys, which is the common name for the young of all marsupial species, are grown and ready to survive, they will be reintroduced into selected areas of Tasmania and probably wider Australia. This will undoubtedly be the best thing that has ever been achieved for the protection of Tasmania's fragile wilderness. Throughout the time of its existence, the Tasmanian tiger played an extremely important role in the food chain as an exclusively carnivorous predator. But since its disappearance, ecosystems have suffered a drastic loss of biodiversity and overall degradation. That's because the absence of an apex predator triggers a process known as trophic downgrading. This leads to ecological problems in the populations of other creatures. The most famous example is the rampant spread of the Tasmanian devil facial tumor disease, which is driving the species to the brink of extinction. The fatal disease was first spotted in 1986, and only in the 2 decades since has the devil's population plummeted by 80 to 90%. Other marsupials such as wallabies and wombats are also at risk, suffering and dying from infectious mange. The decline of these native species has created more favorable conditions for invasive species such as the European rabbit, ferret, red fox, wild boar, feral cat, and many others. Not to mention that the changing abundance of herbivorous marsupials means an overgrowth of plants. This is reflected in the prevalence of yellowing, dry and dead plants, making the landscape look increasingly barren and extremely vulnerable to deadly large-scale wildfires. All of this is due to the lack of a carnivorous supervisor that would prevent the spread of diseases and maintain the health of the populations by removing sick and weak animals. So, the return of the Tasmanian tiger would mean a gradual return to ecological balance and the recovery of ecosystems across the island. But this comeback cannot be delayed for too long. Despite our current conservation efforts, the question is how long this vulnerable unique environment will remain in a repairable state. So let us hope that the biotechnologists have been as accurate as possible in their predictions and that in just over a decade, perhaps exactly in 2036, we will be able to welcome the birth of the most eagerly awaited and important joeys of all time. Surely this would be the best way to mark 100 years since the passing of Benjamin, the most maltreated, the most enduring, the most celebrated, the greatest Tasmanian tiger that ever lived, but above all, the symbol of all the world's overhunted species, and an eternal reminder of what monsters we humans can be.